Hey, Arlen, do you know why barbarians have more groupies than bards?
Why?
Well, bards technically have more skill as performers and entertainers, but barbarians are just all the rage.
Classic.
Most unlikely of villains, schools of pain and for pause. Does it talk? Does it know how? Does it bottle? Does it meow? Let on the Cerebrevore, and I'll show him so much more. Release your brains at the
River of steel.
Yes. You know what it is, don't you, boy? Shall I tell you? It's the least I can do. Steel isn't strong, boy. Flesh is stronger. That is power. The strength and power of flesh. What is steel compared to the hand that wields it? Look at the strength of your body, the desire in your heart. I give you this. Such a waste. Contemplate this on the tree of woe.
We do want to comment before we get into our main topic today. We're going to talk about Conan and the influence Conan has had on role-playing games. But given that we are talking about Conan, and we just lost recently James Earl Jones, we wanted to acknowledge his passing and that just a tremendous body of work he had as an actor and as a performer. And for his Conan, obviously, is the voice of Darth Vader and a lot of other great films over the years. He had a very good range. You know, he did everything from drama to comedy to action and suspense movies. So,
Yeah, Jason wanted an episode on Chris Wilson's. We decided that wasn't really a good fit for this podcast.
Yeah.
It's a shame. Yeah, he's a veteran too.
Yeah.
James Earl Jones was.
Yeah.
So, yeah.
But you know, at 93, he had a long life with a very, wonderful career. So it's not like he died early too. Well, nobody dies too late. You know, he dies if he was still around, but it's not like suddenly that was not expected at his age. So, but he will be missed. So we are going to talk about Conan. Our panel today includes Jason Connerly of Nerds RPG Variety Cast. Jason, how are you?
Excellent. Thank you for having me back.
We have Daniel Norton of Bandits Keep. Daniel, how are you?
I'm doing well. I think this is my first of the rebirth that I've been on.
All right. Yeah.
Yeah, see, so I'm back.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. We have Arlen, live from Pelham's Wasteland. Arlen, how are you doing today?
Doing all right.
And we
I
expect...
want to remind Daniel that that's actually the wrong film franchise, even though it stars one of the same actors. Talking about the one where he wears, a leather loincloth instead of where he shows up wearing nothing at all.
And finally, we are expecting Carl Rodriguez of the Geomologist Presents to join us shortly. So he'll pop in here when he can get to his computer here in a little bit. So we are talking about Howard, specifically Conan. I think the first question we wanted to pose just briefly in general, what do you think when you think of how Conan and by extension Robert E. Howard and his writing, how has that affected your approach to role-playing games in general? Daniel, why don't we kick it off with you? How has that worked? How
Sure.
the major way, just, the biggest way it's influenced you?
I think that when you read Howard's stuff, because I came to it later in life. Like my experience with Conan was the movie when I was a kid, and then some Marvel comics. Like I never read any of the actual short stories until I was back to playing D&D again in like the 2000s. So I think what I take from most of the stories, and this is true of many of the pulp writers, is the ability to craft something really interesting in a short period. Like there's lots of like loose world building where something's mentioned and it kind of makes sense, but it's not fully described. And I do that a lot in my games. Like they'll just be passing people who will just mention something. And then if, obviously in a role-playing game, we can keep exploring it. But if not, it still adds flavor to the world. There's lots of that in Howard's writing and a lot of the pulp writers.
Yeah. Cool. Arlen, what's the biggest way it's influenced your approach to role-playing games?
So I was very briefly into role-playing games when I was a kid, but what really sort of brought me to role-playing games a lot more as an adult after college was actually reading a number of these Howard things. I watched Conan the Barbarian when I was, like 14 or something for the first time, but hadn't read any of the Howard stories. And got really interested in the idea that, well, if you have these dice and rules and stuff, then that's like a way to write that sort of story, basically, that you could take all of these sort of, instead of taking an RPG and having it inspired to feel like a story, you could just take those mechanical elements and use that to structure like your own short story about similar characters and sort of create something evocative from there. So yeah, I mean, I've really enjoyed a lot of the Conan stuff. I think Howard, it's so evocative and so good at balancing the pacing of sequences, right? Reading and RPGs are both, I think, mediums that do not necessarily lend themselves to the combination of like the frantic and the thoughtful. Those are generally kind of at opposite ends of a spectrum. And part of, I think, why Howard is so much fun to read is that he does a really good job of creating that feeling of frantic action in a lot of these stories without ever ending up making it like impossible to understand what's going on, or resorting to the like, well, the fight was over in 4 seconds or something, and just being like, oh, it's such a chaotic thing that you don't have a grasp of like what's actually happening. And that's a real skill that he developed over writing.
Yeah, he's very good at describing action sequences that pull you in and keep the story moving.
Yeah, it's interesting. I was just at Necronomicon and I went to this panel and they were talking about the letters that Howard and I'm going off course and Lovecraft wrote to each other. And one of the things that Howard talks about is that he was trying to achieve this thing because he's like, it's too easy to just have lots of blood and guts and gore, but to make something actually like feel like real, but not cheap in that way. Like he was trying to make it as, feel like it, but not like overly explaining. And it's true. Like you imagine when you're reading a Howard story, like all the stuff going on, but he doesn't get into it. He kind of just, you get that idea. Like he cleaves the guy in half and that's what you get. It's very like over an overview of it without too much detail, but enough that you really picture it. And he does that really well. But that was one of his goals. So it's interesting to see that I think he succeeded very well.
Well, he does such a good job. I think that's the sort of classic tension. Like one of the things you see, because I've been really interested in a lot of the kind of class of writers who are also into HEMA stuff, historical European martial arts is HEMA. And a lot of them know a whole lot more about swordsmanship than I do. Many of them, because they are so into it, right? Part of the thing is that if you spend, basically like 100 words describing an interchange of swords, that takes a lot longer than it actually happens in real life. And so while you get all of this kind of wonderful detail of understanding the mechanics of like why a character does one thing or another, you also lose out on the experiential side of what it's like to actually be in a sword fight where that took, like a second and a half or 2 seconds of very, very tense back and forth. And that I think Howard really demonstrates just how kind of fine that line is between putting in enough detail to understand everything that's happening and understand the decision-making of the characters and all of these things, and also not ever getting into that moment where it's like, okay, yeah, now I know all of what's going on, but it's taken me 3 times as long to understand what happened than it would have taken to actually like have it happen if it was film.
Yeah.
Jason, what do you think is the biggest way it's influenced your life as a role-playing game enthusiast?
I think probably like Daniel, is the Marvel comics and the movies, but I think, and I'll go back to the kids table here. It's probably a little more lowbrow answer, but to me, it's more the viability of the sword and sorcery setting as opposed to high fantasy. I mean, I'm one of the people out there defending AD&D and Gygaxian and D&D and all this stuff. But honestly, my sweet spot in gaming, in fantasy gaming, is sword and sorcery, not high fantasy. I like human centric. I like, these kind of worlds much more than I do your high fantasy magic shops on the corner, the standard D&D kind of trope. My strong preference is your strong sword and sorcery. And obviously Conan and Howard are huge in that respect and influencing that entire genre.
I think for me, something that it probably does go back to pacing, both in the moment and on a broader scale, is I think when I really would love it if, as a DM, my games felt like every week we showed up and there was a Conan short story or a Robert Howard style short story. And that's what it was. That the adventures are episodic. It's not, one may not logically lead to the other, or it may just be, where do you wander? You're just wandering around looking for the next score or the next adventure or the next thing that piques your interest, as opposed to, when we start at level 1, I know where you guys are going to be at level 16, 17, 18 on this grand quest. I really appreciate it. I've fiddled with that, and it's very exhausting as a game master. So I appreciate that concept of a series of adventures over the course of a lifetime, or an adventuring career of characters. So that's the thing I think I appreciate most about what Howard can deliver. And again, in the moment, like, I find that he's who I aspire to be like when I have to narrate the results of an. So we roll initiative. There's a couple of exchanges in combat, or something happens, and I want to give that fast-paced narration. Oh, there was a mighty overhand chop. Oh, he boarded it. It bounced off his shield. Oh, you run him through with your sword, and then we're on to the next sort of moment. So that's, I think, how I like that pacing that Howard gives. So.
What's interesting about that, because I know Carl's about to jump in, but I just want to, what I think is interesting is I just started listening to the audiobook of The Coming of Conan, which is, they basically republished all the Conan stories, but just the ones that Howard wrote, but in publication order. And in the foreword of that, they talk about the idea that Howard wrote them, like, intentionally, at least, and they say that he said this, but I don't think that quotes, because they wanted it to feel like, if you sat down next to an old grizzled veteran and they were telling you the story of their life, they wouldn't just tell you, this is the first thing I ever did, then I did this. They would jump around, and that's how the stories are written. And I was just talking to somebody last night about that. It's like, you want to do that in the game, but how do you play the later story, and how do you actually incorporate that mechanics wise in the game? Like, that would be the tricky part, right? No matter what, no matter how episodic you want to be, you could say, oh, 2 years have gone by, you did this. You're always still going in a straight line in an RPG, because you're always progressing, because you can never play the later guy, because you don't know what happened before, where he can rewrite those stories. Oh, not rewrite, but then he can write the story after the fact. So it's kind of interesting. I mean, it's the ultimate goal, but yet almost like a fool's errand, because you can't actually, I don't know how you would do it. Maybe somebody has that way, and that'll be the ultimate game, really.
Yeah, the way to do that, and then I'll throw it to Carl, arguably, it's not as fun, but if you take a system and you come up with a character at, say, 6 points in their life and stat them out, then you can bounce around, right? So you have, first level Conan, you have 5th level Conan, 10th level Conan, 15th level Conan, and then depending what story you want to tell, you bounce around which set of stats you use.
Right, but what he does, and I think this is what makes the stories powerful, is it's like, he'll tell a story, and he'll be like King Conan, and he'll be like, this giant snake that I'm fighting, I know I can defeat it because I beat one 20 years ago. But if you haven't actually beat this snake 20 years ago yet, like, how do you do that, right? So, right. I guess you could just go off what you're saying. Like, you could be like, well, if I've done it, I've done it. If I haven't, I haven't. But I think that's the real key. That's why I say I think you're right, though. That's how you would do it. You'd have multiple stats, and I guess you just have to have that plot armor, shall we call it?
Well, I think that would be
playing your 3rd level self and you die, right?
That's one of the things I think that makes it difficult in a conventional role playing game, is that that removes the threat of death, at least up until you get to that 15th level version of the character, because you're going to survive, and it sort of takes some of the tension away that you're supposed to have during a role playing game. So,
And what you could do, and I know we're totally, this is what by the way, when you bring it this way, you don't invite me. What you could do, and this is something that I do in my game that I'm building, is you could have it affect them in some way. And we'll talk about that, I guess. See the little, I did that teaser. Listen to the whole episode. Kidding.
Carl,
What
do you think when you think of the works of Robert Howard, whether it's Conan or other stuff, what is the biggest way that has influenced your approach to role-playing games?
That's a big question, and I just joined. How has it influenced my approach to role-playing games? I think ideally I'd like to run like a gritty sword and sorcery type of world, or a sword and sandal type of world. I mean, unfortunately, I think most of the stuff that's out there is like this sort of pseudo high fantasy or amalgamation of everything. But I think, that maybe I have a gritty approach to a world. I have an idea that Robert Howard's idea, especially in his sort of Yog-Sothory and Lovecraftian type cycles, is that I'm probably going to die, but I'm going to die fighting as opposed to curling up and running away. I think that's kind of a mentality that I would have going into, a game, and maybe I expect that of the players, right? Is we're not going to, I guess sometimes you do have to run away, but, or the roll of the dice, compels you to run away. But, I think the approach that I think Howard had and the mentality that, this might be a no-win situation, but we're going to win somehow by the skin of our teeth. And if we don't, well, then we died gloriously. I think that. I jumped into Conan. I jumped into Conan with the. I was kind of looking at it. It was interesting what Daniel was saying. I jumped into Conan with the Lancer Ace paperback series back in the 80s, and I probably like in the middle of that, I saw the Conan the Barbarian. I was like already like, man, this is like a mix of all these stories. But I did like Conan the Barbarian, not saying that. But it's very interesting because the Lancer Ace paperback series, Conan of Cimmeria, etc., right? Those were told in chronological chronological order as far as we knew from the notes of Robert Howard, right? Because Robert Howard did, as Daniel said, is as if you have this old veteran or old warrior telling you his tales, or you're privileged to sit in the with eating dinner with King Conan, and he's telling you, oh yeah, way back when, this is what I did. But I really liked, the one that I reread them more or less recently. I skipped a lot of the derivative pastiche stuff, even though it's written by really good authors like Robert Jordan and stuff. But I jumped back into it when they Del Rey kind of released that Conan of Cimmeria Volume 1. That was more like in order of publication, like Daniel was mentioning. So they did like the Coming of Conan, the Cimmerian, the Bloody Crown of Conan, the Conquering Sword of Conan, going back to how they were released sort of in publication order as opposed. So I think that's really good because that also had notes, and you see the development of Conan stories, culminating almost with the novella Hour of the Dragon. So and I think Hour of the Dragon definitely has influenced me, and I like to read that every few years because it's such a great epic tale in a sword and sorcery verse. The rise and fall of Conan in a short space of time and how he struggles back to win. Right, I guess is
Rise of the Dragon is basically like a greatest hits of the Conan verse, in my opinion. It's basically it's all of the set pieces that you like from all of the other stories, just all put into one story instead of spread out across all the different ones.
No,
I think one other way that I would say it influences what I think a role-playing game should be is I think what you were alluding to, Carl, is larger than life heroes. Whatever they do it big and they do it bold, and it's. I think that's a fun way to play. I think Daniel, I remember you mentioning this in your early episodes where you're starting to develop Unchained, going back to Conan and going, look, these are kind of weak, fragile heroes who can die. Death is on the table, and you have to play carefully in original D&D. But the point is still to play a big, larger than life. Get a couple levels and get up there and still be wading through legions of sort of minions and just knocking them aside like it's nothing until you finally show down with the actual monster or wizard or whoever the actual villain is. And
look at
somewhere got this idea that D&D has always been mudcore, and it really hasn't necessarily always been mudcore.
Yeah. I mean, look at the story of the Tower of the Elephant, right? I mean, it's it's a bit of luck and a bit of but it is kind of crazy what Conan is able to do, and his sidekick gets sorry, spoilers for people if you haven't read Tower of the Elephant, gets sort of whacked, during the course of the story. But then, look how they translated it into Conan the Barbarian. And then I remember, I even think now, like when Subutai is climbing up with the knives, like how do you make a difficulty for that? I mean, what is a DC for that? If you're playing, right. How does that? A character's gonna fail, right? I mean.
You mentioned we mentioned Marvel. I think my first knowledge of Conan was from Conan the Barbarian. And as I got into comics, and he was part of the Marvel Comics universe, extended universe. And I remember I want to talk a little bit about, and this will lead into another brief question I have for you guys is, I have a what if. It's what if Wolverine fought Conan the Barbarian. And so Wolverine gets transported into the Hyperborean age. He hooks up with Red Sonja, and they go on a quest, and then they wind up. I think he winds up cutting off Conan's hand, but Conan still fights him to a draw more or less in combat. But what if she used to also have this tiny little like comic strip at the last? It's kind of a humorous take on the topic, and so it shows Conan and Wolverine in a bar drinking. And Wolverine talking about, sometimes I just get so angry, I get overcome with this berserker rage, and I go blind, and I start just, and Conan's like, yeah, tell me about it. And he, downs a flagon of ale. And rage has become, at least in sort of D&D and Pathfinder, such a defining feature of the barbarian archetype. But, it really didn't enter the barbarian archetype in D&D until third edition. Even in second edition, when they introduced Berserker Rage as something you could do, like I think as a fighter kit, that was not the barbarian fighter kit. That was the Berserker. It was separate. They had a different barbarian one that was much more like Conan from the stories. And I'm trying to remember. Yeah. I think you get a Blood Rage in the Frost Giant's daughter, but that's almost because she's tried to ensorcel him, and it blows up in her face when she does it. I don't remember reading
so you get a couple.
A couple, yeah, but that's not
you
the
get a couple
defining.
Of rages.
Yeah,
it's not necessarily a totally defining element, but you do have a number of places where Howard describes Conan's rage, and especially in a couple of places where he describes how, like, Conan's buddy has to keep the enemies off of his back because Conan is in such a rage that he's not paying any attention to being, outflanked or ambushed or anything like that. He's just, totally seeing red. So there is a little bit of that, but definitely I think when you think about like what does the barbarian actually like do in modern D&D, what the barbarian does is says, I want to rage when combat starts, and then uses all of their rage abilities. And Conan does do some raging. He gets mad sometimes, but he definitely also doesn't. I think very rarely does he fight without any sense of tactics, right? And that's kind of the big difference is that the berserker rage as like totally overwhelming everything happens every once in a while, but mostly Conan is as much a very canny fighter as he is a enraged fighter. Right.
Yeah, I agree with that. And I think what's interesting about rage in general is when it does happen, as far as I can remember any of the Conan stories, it's a bad thing, right? Like Arlo was saying, like he's not watching his back. He's like kind of lost control. Whereas in like D&D, as I remember it, like it's a good thing. It's like you're raging. Now you have immunity to this and you're more powerful. So it's like it's not really the same thing. It's more like losing control, and that's bad then, because Conan is all about control. Like he is somebody who has a really great resistance to stuff, right? Like he can handle it, whether it's having to lift something or overcome something. He's starving, he's tired. He's going to push himself to that ultimate limit. His like constitution, if you want to put it in gaming terms, is like really the thing. Like he's all muscly or whatever, if you, especially the comics. But really, that's where he is. He's all constitution. And a little bit of kind of leader, like people follow him for whatever reason, mostly because he's excellent at what he does. And I think that's really, Conan, like that's his strength. And I want to say in second edition, I could be wrong. I think Carl was looking over the book.
I was looking through Unearthed Arcana, but Rage.
The second edition book fighter, Ultimate Fighter, whatever it's called, the barbarian build is like a charisma build by like what today's standards would be, which I thought was super interesting. I remember looking at it and going, because I wanted a rager when I was looking at it, I was like, oh no, this doesn't rage. It's like bonus to charisma, and you can like assemble hordes and stuff. And it's like, how is that? Then that's before I started reading the story, the real stories, not just the comics, right? The stories where Conan is leading armies and is a captain of a pirate ship and all these other things where he is a leader, and that's really a major thing for him, is that he's basically leading people. And what we miss a lot in the D&Dism of Conan is that a lot of these stories, there are large scale battles. Like that is actually a big component in a lot of these stories. Not all of them, of course, like Tower of the Elephant, no. But a lot of them, there are big battles, whether it be pirate ship versus pirate ship or huge armies fighting.
Right. Yep. That's interesting because as I did flip through Unearthed Arcana, there's no rage in that. So the barbarian is more like of a wilderness type fighter.
I always said the barbarian on Arcana is just a better ranger than the ranger.
Pretty much. and then there's a big component of it is like can summon a horde at some point, right? So it is kind of a leadership, a wild wilderness fighter, and it's a distinction from like a berserk, right? So like
out.
In a lot more modern game, sorry, Harlan. In a more modern game, I'll finish and then you can contradict me. So in the more modern game like Hyperborea, there is a distinction between barbarian as sort of a wilderness type fighter with a lot of cool wilderness type skills, and then a berserk who is the rager, right? So
standing out Aragorn as a barbarian with all the charisma bonuses, and his summon horde ability is when he summons the army of the dead.
Oh, there you go.
Yeah.
I'm sure there's an archetype for that in some 3.5 or Pathfinder Splat book.
Jason, any thoughts on barbarian rage and kind of that way it's sort of evolved?
No, because I didn't follow. I stopped with AD&D first edition. I haven't followed the non-Gygaxian versions of AD&D, not AD&D, but D&D. So I can't comment on that.
But it's pretty par for so many of the. If you look at the origins of so many of the character classes that we have now, back into where they were from D&D and AD&D, you're like, wow, how did we get from that to that?
Well, that's why I have a question for Jason then. So like you've probably seen like at least a Pathfinder. I don't know if you've seen a 5e barbarian. So what do you think when you think barbarian? What do you think? And then when you see that barbarian with the rage component since 3.5 basic or 3.0 actually, basically, like what do you think? I mean, I haven't. How does it compare with your expectation? Right? Oh,
yeah, I haven't really looked at them. I honestly can't comment on that. I'm playing in Pathfinder, but the only class I've looked at is the one I'm playing, which is a monk. So it's something different. Hyperborea, of course, like you say, breaks them up.
Right.
So it breaks the Berserker and the Barbarian up into two separate classes. So, but yeah, I don't play those games, so I can't. It's not fair for me to comment on it.
I think in current 5e, you can almost, instead of calling it rage, you should just call it, battle trance. They go into some sort of altered state of consciousness that enhances their senses and their focus, and they're amped up. But a D&D modern D&D barbarian raging can still very much engage in tactical and in strategic combat. They're not. I believe in second edition when they introduced the berserk, it was like, there's a chance you're gonna turn on your allies, but before you calm down, and then they kind of phase that out when they moved to third edition.
I like that though.
Although they can't cast spells while they're raging in basically any of the modern versions still. So
there's a workaround.
Yeah.
Because there's this workaround build where you can be a barbarian that when you rage every round, some magic thing explodes from you.
So, that's wild. It's wild magic. You've absorbed magic.
Magic barbarian.
You absorb magic from the Feywild, and it comes out when you go into a rage.
Yeah. See, BJ explains it in like the happy terms, but I'm like, okay, whatever.
I mean, no, that's totally from Howard.
Yeah, totally.
Yeah.
I don't know.
Last thing,
maybe when Conan went to Lewis Carroll's Alice in Wonderland.
Yeah, there you go.
In that story.
So hey, why not mix some genres?
A little crossover there. So last question for you guys. This is probably the most important one we'll get to in this episode. How are you supposed to pronounce this character's name? They call him Conan the Barbarian in the movie, so I've just always called him Conan. And then every now and then I'll hear somebody say Conan or Conan, and I'm like, huh? But but then I'm thinking, you know what? I probably just always hear Conan when I'm not paying attention because that's how it sounds in my head because that's was in the movie. But I dug into that a few weeks ago, and I guess I don't know. I would assume that since Howard was from West Texas, he probably said Conan because he probably had a Southern drawl or a Texas drawl. But I guess if you go back to the origins of the Gaelic origins of the name, it would Conan or Conan would be the more appropriate. Conan O'Brien, they always call him Conan or Conan. It's the only other person I know.
Yeah, I mean, Howard was an American, so in American, it's Conan. I think now, if you want to look back to the Queen's English or something else, it might be different. But here in America, it's I think it's Conan.
I'm thinking of some American podcasts.
How did Vincent D'Onofrio pronounce it? How did D'Onofrio pronounce it in the biographical movie?
He says bold Conan.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I feel like
the damnedest bastard there ever was.
Yeah. So I go with that personally.
There you go.
Yeah, I'll defer to others though.
Yeah, I guess I feel like the construct is like Connor, right? So it'd be like Conan, but Conan is what I've always said.
So
yeah, I've always heard Conan, and the slight differences the way you're saying it just more of like a regional or how fast somebody's saying it. Like if two people said this, that, I would still think it was the same thing. No. So I've always said Conan. Although, interestingly enough, I was listening to an audiobook and they were pronouncing. So how do you say where he's from? Because I've heard that pronounced a lot of different times. So there we go. Because Conan is not Conan the Barbarian, right? He's from Samaria or Chimeria or however you want to,
Yeah.
So I've heard different like audiobook authors pronounce it differently, and I was like, oh, hold on, what?
So if we want to be authentic, it should definitely be Chimeria because it's a Greek word, and they use the K sound for all of their basically like everything that we hear as a C is a K, or it's the CH from the Chi, right? So it's yeah. But I also think that most people just say Samaria because I mean it's sort of like saying Caesar instead of Kaiser, and it's like, well, if you say Kaiser, you kind of sound, you're trying a little too hard to pronounce it like Latin, nerd.
Stop trying so hard.
You mean like 19th century Prussia, Kaiser?
Yeah.
But
all right. Well, let's move on to kind of some of the questions we had talked about covering. There have been so many role-playing Conan specific role-playing games.
Right.
And so we talked about everybody taking one and then talking a little bit about it, just kind of giving either the elevator pitch or the brief summary. If you're going to explain this game to someone who never played it, what would you tell them? And Daniel, I know you talked about OD&D. This is a more recent use of OD&D, but taking the Age of Conan, I think video game kind of concept, but they used OD&D to hack it to turn it into a tabletop game. So what do you want to tell us about the Age of Conan?
There's also an Age of Conan video game, but I don't think it's related aside from sharing a name.
Okay.
The Age of Conan was an MMO by Funcom that was special in that instead of having just scanty clothing, you could have no clothing at all.
Nice, my kind of game. All right, so you're talking about the players, right? All right, so I'm going to talk about Age of Conan. This was done by Jason Vey, and there's a lot of people that influenced it. You can get it for free. It's on, I think it's Grey Elf. I'm sure we'll put a link. This is super special to me, mostly because this completely changed the way I play. So the game itself, though, the Conan part is really interesting. What you get here is a stripping down of OD&D. They tell you, you can use all the different supplements, but it goes through OD&D to kind of like chops things away. Like, for instance, it says in Conan, there's no fantasy and magic users. In clerics, there's sorcerers. So it kind of combines that into a class. They talk about different regions having different classes. So you can be an assassin, but only if you're from certain regions. And it also goes through and you've got your various, I'm looking at the book here. I'll turn my light on so it's going to be really bright. Like you can be a veneer. I'm not going to pronounce all this right. You can be a Chimerian or a Cimmerian or however you said it, we were supposed to say it. Himalayan. You can be a Hyperborean, a Hyborian. So it has all the different races. Now, of course, in Conan, he encounters all kinds of races, but race in the sense that, different peoples, that is. They're all human, except maybe with the exception, maybe the Hyperboreans aren't quite people. it talks a little bit about their culture. And basically, you get some benefits, including a rage, which is basically based on like a berserker rage. The Veneer or Azer, which are based on, I think that's based on like your Norse kind of people. They get the berserker rage, but so can Conan if you want to be a Cimmerian or would you say Cimmerian. And so I like this a lot because it kind of gives you a lot more flavor. It's not just like, well, we're doing sword and sorcery, everybody's just human. Like this is really laying out like here's some different humans. It's probably not ideal for some tables because it does basically say like this, type of human gets a minus to their this and a plus to this, which some people may not love. Especially considering the races that get minus to intelligence and stuff. I'm not going to go into that. But that we break down, it talks about the various character classes and it goes D6 with everything. But really what makes this work for me, this is why I love this for Conan, is that it introduces using chainmail as the combat system. And not just using chainmail as one of the combat systems, it uses all three combat systems. So if anybody's ever seen anything I've ever talked about, this is the origin of it for me. And as I mentioned earlier, in Conan, he does all kinds of different things. He fights wars, he gets involved in small scale skirmishes, he fights one-on-one, he fights monsters. And instead of it always being AC hit point weapon, this breaks it down. Each type of combat feels different. And I think because of that, it really feels a lot more like you're in those worlds. It doesn't just feel samey to me. Now, and I know a lot of people love single, things. Well, it's easier single resolution. But when I'm fighting a war game and I put down pieces on the board, I'm like, all right, your army's fighting my army. I want it to feel different, right? When I'm fighting a monster, maybe I want it to feel different. And it does that. It also does a good job of going through the monsters and going, this would fit in the world, this wouldn't, this might be how you'd use it, this is how you wouldn't use it. So I think it's pretty good. It's also free, so totally worth it. If you're interested at all in using Conan, it talks about I think what we get here is a really good way to make D&D, if you want to do this, into a sword and sorcery game. I think that that's not necessarily the best option, but I think if that's what you're going to do, that's what you do. In my discovery of this and building my own system, I actually stripped away all of the D&D for the most part, and I found that chainmail itself was a better sword and sorcery game because the components of chain to what you see in Howard. The idea that like magic is powerful but rare and devastating, right? It's not, people aren't walking around just casting spells. They're moving mountains with it and doing, all this other, poison gas things, wiping out hundreds of soldiers. That's what you do in chainmail, all right? So if you could, I backed way more into chainmail with my own personal. And the other thing I want to talk about really briefly is, because I also mentioned this, because I messed with this, TSR did with AD&D Conan modules. They also did Conan game, which I believe Jason's going to talk about. And they did 3 of them. I only ran 1. So I'm going to say there's 3. There's actually only 2. There's Conan 1, Conan 2, and then there's a Red Sonja, which is basically in the same world. And what they did here is they basically did, if this is how you should run these, by the way. If you're going to run these, and I recommend you give them a shot if you can find them. They're not available on drive-through, so you either have to be nefarious or, Conan started off as a thief, so you might be all right with that. Or you can find them like on eBay or whatever. But they actually give you the characters to play, much like Marvel superheroes did. And I find that TSR's old Marvel superheroes was stronger for that reason. Here's a module for Spider-Man. Beep Spider-Man. Don't be Thor in the Spider-Man module. It's not going to work as well, right? And so but they add a couple components I just want to quickly go through. They change healing, so it's more rapid because they remove healing spells, which is a common, sword and sorcery thing, no healing magic. I'm not sure that I totally agree with that, though. Maybe that's something we could talk about if we have time. They add a luck/heroism because, again, Conan in the like, you don't always want the dice to decide. Conan has to ultimately have a pretty good chance of winning, right? So this idea of having luck points, I think, is really useful. They add that to this. And they add a fear mechanic because, again, the unknown is something to be feared. In D&D, in its nature, people want to fight stuff. You see a dragon, you charge at it, you fight it, right? Which maybe isn't how a lot of people might react. I know there's fear effect on dragons and stuff, so maybe that wasn't a good example. But they add those 3 things to this, and then they also make the modules 10 to 14th level. That's where Conan's at. So I think when you're thinking about Conan, it's not, going back to what BJ's kind of said at the beginning, it's hard to play Conan when you're first level. Like Conan started high level, right? In his youngest story, which I believe is Tower of the Elephant, he's already a devastating swordsman. He's already smart. He's not quite, as adept as he will be, but adept, not adept. But he is a masterful swordman. He's already high level, right? He kills people in a stroke. He jumps over walls. He fights monsters, right? He can figure things out. You're playing sword and sorcery. Maybe first level characters, this mudcore idea isn't really sword and sorcery. That's something else. And I don't know if that's how other people think about that. But yeah, I think in the end, having characters that are powerful, that can do things that defy even the dice sometimes, and being able to do multiple types of combat is how you're going to get a Conan story to work. And I think that the AD&D thing is fun if you just want to mess with it. I think if you're going to pick something that's right off the thing, it's free, I'd give Age of Conan a shot. It's easy, easy to run, and it might change the way you think about like how combat is.
I'll say so my understanding is that the two that are generally cited as either of the two stories where he's the youngest are either Tower of the Elephant or Frost Giant's Daughter.
Oh.
And yeah, he is definitely not like your classic first level. I mean, Frost Giant's Daughter, he kills 2 frost giants after being the only survivor on his side of a large battle, and then still runs down the frost giant's daughter after that because he's in good enough shape to do that. And then, Tower of the Elephant, definitely not your first level OSR. I rolled 3d6 down the line and I guess I got a 10 strength, so I'm playing a fighter.
Yeah. Jason, you want to tell us a little bit about TSR Conan?
Yeah. So the thing real quickly TSR did is they did some like choose your own adventure books, like endless books, or they might have actually called these something else. They had a couple different ones, but they did some Conan books like that, which those books usually featured young Conan in there. But in 1985, they released the Conan role-playing game, which was written by Zeb Cook, and it's actually a really pretty fascinating game. It uses a color chart like Marvel superheroes. It's not the same chart though. So in Gamma World, they came out with, I think it was 3rd edition Gamma World that had the chart. That was pretty much exactly the same thing as the Marvel superhero chart, where this one doesn't have as much on there. And it's set up a little bit differently, but it still has the same color scheme and the same idea. It's a percentile-based game. It came in a box, had a 32-page rule book. 32 pages covered all your rules. It had a 16-page reference guide with tables and charts and lists of things. And it had a 48-page notebook, which was your world guide. And that book the conceit was it was written by a scholar who was trying to, say Hyboria was real. And it has these scribbled notes in the margins and stuff. So it's kind of cool. It's all based straight off the Howard stories. But this game has luck points. Just like what Daniel was saying, this game has luck points. It has meta currency that you would use to do rerolls, or you can use to reduce the damage to a character. It has, instead of attributes, it just has trait pools. So you have a couple different traits. Your traits are set up and they have sub traits underneath each of those traits. So under fighting, you have sword, brawling, wrestling. Under endurance, you have damage, stamina, will, things like that. Kind of just like when you think of D6 Star Wars or Ghostbusters, the D6 systems that came later had the same kind of thing where you had an overall pool and then sub talents underneath those. And if you don't have the specific talent, then you roll on whatever your pool score is. And the way you do just about everything's done off this chart. You take your score, you take the opposing score you're rolling against, you subtract one from the other, and that's the column you roll against. It's really fast. It's really efficient. You could shift columns if you need to in some instances. Some of the other interesting things we have in this game is it builds in the idea of a life path and the idea where Conan, of course, doesn't jump forward. When we meet Conan, he's already done a bunch of things in his life. So it's designed that way. You pick the land you come from, you pick your father, and then you have to put points in your father's occupation. And then basically the way the character sheet's set up, it's set up where you write, has a big section called story, and you fill in there and basically you do a sentence explaining where you got each of the skills and you kind of giving your background. So you build out this background as part of this, telling the story of your hero, which is kind of neat. You have fairly low hit points on this. So it is lethal. You can instant kill people with headshots. If you get the red result, if you get a critical headshot, you can instant kill people. It has rules in here for mooks. It breaks your opponents up into enemies and foes, and enemies are basically rabble or mooks, 1985, and the foes are equivalent to the PCs. It's got a lot of neat things in here. There's a beginning adventure in this 32-page rulebook. There's a beginning adventure for Tower of the Elephant. I mean, it's that adventure. And it's meant to be played one-on-one. You have the game master and you have one player who plays 17-year-old Conan. They give you his stats, and you play through the Tower of the Elephant. It's a really neat game. Unfortunately, it's also very expensive, $100, $200 to get a copy these days. You can find the rule system with the Conan IP pulled out of it. It's called Zephyrs. Z is in zebra, ERFS. And you can find that for free. You can actually find it on the Grey Elf website. You can find a copy of these rules with the IP stripped out. You can get it on Lulu, a cheap print on demand. It's really interesting. It's worth looking at for some of these things. In 1985, it was really forward thinking in a lot of the things it did. I'd like to give it a shot one of these days. But yeah, so they did 3 supplements for it. It didn't sell well. And, unfortunately, then it disappeared pretty quickly. And the next Conan property is one that Carl's more familiar with. So I'll have to pass the idea of GURPS and Mongoose over to Carl.
Tell us a little bit about the Mongoose Conan D20 game.
Yeah, I was re-looking at it a little bit, and it's a pretty fascinating system. It's a OGL product based off of 3rd edition, and it's made by Mongoose. It's published in, I believe, I had that up. It's first published in 2004, and then they had a 2nd edition in 2007, and it is amazingly supported. I mean, there's supplements, so many supplements. There's even one of my favorite was this one on Missantia, a box set on the Missantia, the City of Riches. They have stuff on the Pirate Isles, a lot of adventures. I really enjoyed it, and I think that I did try it out a few times. It's got the 3.5 character building. I don't know if it's issues, but it's very intense on the character building. Skills have cross-class things that give bonuses. So there's a lot of front-end character building, but I think something that was kind of cool that I thought about it is it's almost like a low-level game in a high-adventure world, right? So in a lot of modern games, especially adventures, right, the bad guys sort of scale with the good guys, with the adventurers, right? So in their starting town, your your town guard is like 1st level, and the captain's like 3rd level, and then you go to the big city, and then it's like 3rd level and 6th level or something. But in Conan, that kind of stays the same, and then there's a level cap at 10th level, right? So it just goes from 1 to 10. And then I think what's very interesting too, they do a lot of different things with combat, making so there's like you have to consider damage reduction for types of armor. There's a pairing mechanic. There's some challenge to initially doing some of these first combats if you're playing the game, because you have to kind of understand how the pairing works, and then how damage reduction versus the attack that you do. So there's some challenge in that, but I think once you get it kind of flows and works really well. But I think that's and the magic system too is not. There's only one. There's a number of particular classes. They do have this thing where the ethnic groups, they call them races in this game. The ethnic groups have a bonus and a minus, and some of them could be considered problematic nowadays. But there's always I think conventionally in 3.5, there's always a +2 bonus to stats and a -2 to stats, right? So in 5e, it's pluses out all around, right? You can't have minuses. So anyway, so there's only one magic using class, the scholar, and that you can be a priest and you can be a magician from that. And then they use power points for the magic system, such that the powerful spells. There's no way a character is going to be able to cast a powerful spell by themselves. They're going to have to perform a ritual. So they have this introduction of ritual, which I think flows with the fiction, right? These spellcasters spend time, sacrificing, animals and people to power their spell, and it's over the course of days that this happens, right? So yeah, I think it's pretty neat that they really tried, I think, to make it a little bit of gritty, to make combat dynamic, to make the magic a challenge and rare, right? So something that people have mentioned already, and that's kind of the way the fiction is, right? It is strange. Magic is strange. Sorcerers are not are fear. They're feared, right? And they're not like a dime a dozen, right? They're not like everywhere. There's not a magic shop on every corner, right? Magic is rare and subtle, and then you have these. You have to build the magic because it's some sort of ritual and petitioning to some other worldly force. And I think the Mongoose Conan really is able to capture that. It's not a bad game. We're talking about the Frost Giant's daughter, and they do have an adventure, the Frost Giant's daughter. I think it was 3rd level. And I think my players, when they ran into the, I believe, I mean, I guess the other conceit is that you're not going to play Conan, right? You're not going to play Conan. You're playing in the world that Conan lived in, right? Yep. So you're not. I mean, I guess you're aspiring to be a hero, like you've heard of these tales or whatever, but you're not going to be him. So I don't know. These 3rd level characters trying to go up against these frost giants, it doesn't.
It's always interesting to me is comments Conan will make in the Howard stories when he's kind of contemptuous of civilized men as weak, and he'll say something like, "In my country, a boy of 12 can," and you're like, "Is Conan that exceptional as a Cimmerian, or is it just the comparison? Like, is everyone else just need to be thankful that the Cimmerians never unite in a horde and just come forth, because an army of like 1,000 Conans would be terrifying."
Well, you know what?
I don't know. In the fiction, they did it. They attacked like the northern parts of Aquilonia, the Bosonian marches or whatever, and they took some early gains, but they couldn't consolidate, and they were pushed back. So
yeah. I mean, there's the sort of world history, but yeah. So I know
Venarium gets sacked basically there's Harry Turtledove, who wrote a number of other things, wrote a Conan pastiche about the sacking of Venarium, which is referenced in the Howard stories, but it's presented as basically because I think it's in Beyond the Black River that Conan mentions it and says he was there, and somebody's like, "Oh, that was like 20 years ago," and it's like, "Yeah, I was like 13." And that's where I killed my first civilized man because they're so weak.
Yeah, it's funny. I was watching a YouTube video. I can't remember who it was from, but they were like a book reviewer / movies. And they said one thing that you should never do in a Conan story is have another Cimmerian, because the fact that he is like different is part of his like mystique, right? Like he's from you hear about it. There's legends about that land. There's legends about those warriors, but you don't walk into another one in the bar. It's like, "Oh, I've never seen one of you." Like that's kind of what Conan is. He's like a unique, he's like the only elf in a D&D campaign where everybody's human, right? Like he just sticks out, right? And that's actually part of what makes Conan in the stories. It's funny though, you think about Frost Giant's daughter and you're saying they're 3rd level, but that was a party of adventurers, right?
Yeah, it was a party of adventurers.
Yeah, which I think is one of the things that's interesting. And now I know that Jason wants to talk, and I totally jumped over him, but this is not about that. Is that that's one of the things about Conan, right? He's often by himself. So maybe I don't know if we're going to talk about that at some point.
At best, with a sidekick, right?
Yeah, so that makes it a little bit more difficult to run that kind of stuff. So Jason was going to talk about magic, I think.
Yeah, Jason, you want to make
I just wanted to say I'm glad Carl mentioned that, because there are 2 things I left out with. We talk about how advanced some of the ideas in here were. Mm-hmm. It's all point by this 85 TSR Conan that Zeb Cook did. It's point by, and you can buy weaknesses to get more points, just like in say GURPS or one of these other games, right? It's exactly like that. Only you have to buy, like I say, you have to buy points in your father's talent to build your father's occupation, which is kind of cool. But the magic, you can be a magic user, but you can't just buy points and be a magic user. You still have to go on quests, and it takes years to learn some of the magic, and they don't have a spell list. You work with you learn a field Like you're going to learn about summoning, or you're going to learn about transmutation, but you work with the GM to make the spells and design the spells, and you have to quest and do this stuff. But magic users are hated. They gain obsessions. And like the more powerful spells cost hit points to cast that you permanently lose, that you can't heal back.
Jeez.
So it really discourages player magic users. And I think that's important in this genre. Because to me, we don't really see our heroes as magic users, especially in the older sword and sorcery stuff. And so it's really interesting this game does that. But the idea of like making your own spells with your GM, but so we're seeing these early things that will come back in later sword and sorcery games back in this 85 game.
Yeah, it's interesting. I kind of said, they don't have magic users and clerics. They have a sorcerer that I didn't actually talk about. I just want to briefly talk about it because it's similar. They're supposed to be rare. It uses chainmail's roll to cast system. And you can you can basically knock yourself out if you screw up on the casting. You take corruption over time, it's become like distorted. Spells are hard to get. Because the one thing they're trying to do here is make it so that you won't play a magic user, right? And I think that's so interesting because I feel like just saying you can't play one would be easier, but I feel like these games never want to do that, right? So what I don't use and it's probably a fine supplement, but there's another supplement called Age of Acheron, which is lots of magic stuff. And it's really cool. It actually is. But I feel like this almost makes you want to be a magic user because it's so good. Like, it's so interesting. It still is hard. And you still have to, and this has human sacrifice and this and that. Because that's what you do, right? Like you're playing a game and you're like, all right, you have to sacrifice 5 hit points to cast a spell. I mean, me as a player being an evil sorcerer, right? Because that's what you'd be in. This would be like, can I just kill somebody for it? It has to be my hit points, and I feel like just addressing that up front in a game and either saying yes or no on that is a good idea. So I like that it's in here. I would not use it. I mean, I would not play, my group would not play characters that would have to make human sacrifices to cast spells, but that's what the bad guys do. So it's kind of cool to have some reference to it in here. But I think that I've noticed that in a lot of these sword and sorcery things is that they do encourage you to not be a magic user by having reasons, And the other thing they do in this, which I also forgot that is really cool, is it's OD&D, but they allow you to multi-class. They basically say if you start at first level, then you can pick 2 classes right away. You have to choose which one you're going to play each, because they're trying to be gamey, but you can progress. So you can be a fighter thief, but you can, if you're a sorcerer, you can only be a sorcerer. So you could be the ranger equivalent in a thief. You could be a fighter. And I like that because, again, when you look at these TSR builds of these characters, they're all like these, not possible by the rules multi-class characters.
Right. And that was the thing with the 85 TSR one is it's a classless game. It's all based around your talents. So
yeah.
And
no class.
I'll hop in to just make one comment about Magic, which is that I think it's interesting all of these games trying to figure out how to handle Magic in Conan, where a great deal of the magic is not necessarily particularly useful to an adventuring character, which is, I think, one of the big things that a lot of these games run into, that a lot of the magic in the Hyborian Age doesn't really make sense for an adventurer to actually use, because it's things like, figuring out information from dreams or, being able to concoct something alchemically that is probably not going to happen like live in the adventure, but is totally interesting for kind of the background of the world. And there's sort of it's kind of an interesting tension, I think, to me, this idea of, well, magic is definitely a part of these stories, but the actual magic that happens, and even like the dangerous magic, is like, okay, well, it's more impressive to Temple of Doom a person's heart, but Conan could just stab them, right? It's not actually that much more useful than doing something than doing the regular version of that.
Jason, you got it.
Right. And my last thing on that, I'm glad you brought that up, because when you look at the overall fields of magic in this 85 game, there are alchemy, information, summoning, mind control, natural magic, and transmutation. So they fall into those kind of broad things like you see in the story. They really took their time and read the Howard stories to build this game, which is nice that they did that.
It sounds like it. And I'll say also about the magic is that like if we were just talking about Hour of the Dragon, right? They use, spoilers, they use magic to like make somebody sick, or they put a plague on a town in that, right? Like, so that might be useful to some adventuring parties. but yes, generally speaking, it's like not something you would do, right? And they also they do use illusions. So I think those things exist, but right, they're not something you walk around just cast. I think that the magic and this game does a good job of saying that as well. Like it's like they remove fireball and all that kind of stuff. It's like the spells you get are like charm person and illusion spells, curses. Because I think that's more the line of right. You're not going into a delve a dungeon and bringing your like knock spell, right? That's not a Howard, type magic. Yeah.
So Arlen, the last specific Conan game that was branded as a Conan game that we wanted to talk about is Modiphius's 2D20, which is just cycled through. They've lost their license, so that's a complete system now that if you can get a hand of it, you don't have to worry about more supplements coming out, at least not official ones.
Yep. Everything has been published. Like all of the great empires, they rise and then they fall to be overtaken by others, which Howard would have certainly appreciated the way that Modiphius no longer has control of that IP, and so now it's dead. And so it's sort of like an ancient empire that's been left in its ruins for us to delve into. Conan 2D20 is a really interesting beast, I think. It's a game that I have enjoyed a lot and played a lot and ran a lot, and probably won't do that much with the system going forward. Not because the system is necessarily bad or because I only want to play games that things are getting published for, but I think Conan 2D20 comes at kind of an odd place within the publishing life cycle of Modiphius and 2D20 games. It was not the earliest because there was an Infinity game before it, and there might have been one or two others, but it was very early in Modiphius working on these 2D20 games, and I think there are a lot of rough edges that they have figured out how to deal with in later games. And also it was a part of what was at the time a really, really big Kickstarter for RPGs that now doesn't seem like that big of a Kickstarter for RPGs, but at the time it was a really big deal. And they promised a ton of splat books, and that's part of why there are so many splat books. And they're good, and they have like nice art, and the people who have written them have done their research, but there's so goddamn many of them that it's really kind of difficult to grapple with in some ways. And they do an odd thing with the splat books. I guess it's not odd, but a specific thing with the splat books where there are a couple of them that are like broadly about some concept. So there's like horrors of the Hyborian Age that is a lot of like monstrous supernatural stuff, and that's pretty cool. Or there's like ancient ruins and nameless cults that's all about like adventuring sites and weird antagonist things and all that sort of stuff. But a lot of them are things like it'll be Conan the Thief, and it covers a section of the world. And so you get, here's some professions which are used in first building your character. They're basically like a collection of things that you get to represent your adventuring background. And here's a handful of items that are sort of flavorful to this part of the world. And here's a gazetteer of this part of the world and some monsters, all of which is sort of contained into one book instead of having like one book with all of the monsters and one book that's all gazetteer and one book that's all the items and stuff, which is not the end of the world by any means, but I do think it makes it a little more difficult to approach if you're not already really familiar with what's in those books. And the total space devoted to the Hyborian world across all those books is greater than like all of the words that Robert E. Howard wrote about this world. So you can just go read the stories instead of reading these splat books.
Yeah.
But to talk about the system itself, at least a little bit, 2D20, the system is based on the idea of rolling D20s, trying to get under a certain number to get successes. You start with 2D20s, and then you can potentially roll more with a resource called momentum. It's, in this case, totally classless. You have a lot of elements that build up your character, sort of like a life path, although it's not like Burning Wheel life path where you have like, here's what you did then, and then it's more kind of broadly like, here's the culture you come from and you get stuff from that. Here's your background as an adventurer. Like, are you a mercenary, or are you a thief, or are you a priest? Here's like an event that you lived through that made a big impact on you, all of that sort of stuff to get your character. But after you've created your character, all of that is sort of flavor for the character and all of this mechanical stuff, but there's not really anything like enforcing you to continue playing that type of character or to not, put your points wherever you want, anything like that. There are some also odd elements where the math of the game, there's some really flavorful elements that definitely kind of I wouldn't say are completely broken, but are, I think, unintended consequences of elements working together. For instance, one of the cool rules that is flavorful is that there are a number of weapons that are classed as, I don't remember what they're called, like bulky or something. And basically what it means is that they're a two-handed weapon unless you have a certain level of brawn, one of the stats, in which case they become a one-handed weapon. And so this is how they handle like Conan's broadsword being basically like a medieval longsword that is sort of usable with two hands or with one hand if you're big and strong. So if you have a character that basically you just want to be really good at killing things, you can create a dude who has enough strength and agility, which is what you use for hitting people, to basically just wade into a mob of enemies with a bastard sword in one hand and a battle axe in the other and kill, basically like 30 hits worth of enemies within one round because you can just stack up all of these bonuses. Which, to be clear, is something that Conan probably could do, but is also something that is going to make it really difficult for a game master to run a lot of the kind of adventures as intended against a character like that. So it's kind of an odd beast in that way. I think there's a lot of elements like that are flavorful. So like there are very few like weapon abilities based on the character, but almost all the weapons have some type of characteristic that defines how to use them, which is kind of a cool thing. It's very similar to the idea of Conan just picks up a weapon off the battlefield and he knows enough about how to use it in its intended way, but it's not like he has like a specific weapon master feat or like a specific, a special maneuver that he uses with his one broadsword or something like that. The magic is also kind of an interesting beast. It does similarly to what we've talked about a lot. A lot of the magical, you basically get one spell if you create a caster. You can get more spells, but your one spell has kind of a broad collection of things that it can do that are all sort of related to the core concept. And every spell has basically a table of effects that you can choose from when you roll to cast to get these specific effects. So, for instance, one of the spells that is both really interesting and really flavorful to Howard and definitely problematic is the ancestral memories idea that Howard was not the only person who followed. Jack London has a book that follows this idea of ancestral memories also. But Howard was really into this idea that a person could basically in dreaming remember what their ancestors lived through and experienced. And so one of the spells is basically to be able to do that at will, and you can essentially save up knowledge from the past and use that to be like good at something that your character is otherwise not good at because you're remembering that they know like how to make a fire or something like that. Really flavorful, interesting stuff. It also runs into the classic problem of, like I said, half of the spells on the list are things that are not going to be super useful in all of these action scenes and are a lot more related to like the build up to this stuff, all of the different ways to divine information that are probably really useful in the world. But it's a little bit like the idea that people in D&D worlds use Mage Hand to be able to plant 2 rows of grain at once. That like, okay, well, that's not what the adventurers are going to use it for. So it's kind of an odd beast. I like the game a lot. There's some really great art for it in particular because they did a whole bunch of very recognizable. I mean, a lot of the different famous moments from these Howard stories, a number of and so it's cool to see like, oh, here's Frost Giant's Daughter that is inspired by all of these other versions of Frost Giant's Daughter. Here's Conan attacking the ape and rogues in the house, but it's a little bit different than the other versions that you've seen. Things like that. I kind of think that have in elements that I probably use the John Carter 2D20 game to run a Conan game in the future. Because I will say, one of the core things that I think is actually like where 2D20 really succeeds for this genre is, as we talked about, Conan has sidekicks sometimes, but very rarely is it like a party of equals. Maybe just in something like Tower of the Elephant, where it's also, a master thief who joins him, who is, he's sort of presented as a sidekick in the actual story, but conceptually he ought to be basically Conan's equal in all of these things. He just happens to die earlier. And one of the things that the momentum system does really well is allowing the party to compensate for a character who otherwise couldn't do something that would limit the abilities of the party as a whole. Whereas the classic D&D problem of, well, if the thief comes up something, what does the rest of the party do? Do you, bring rope and crampons and figure out a way to make some sort of climbing rolls or something like that? And Momentum handles this, I think, really well. That, like, you have the one character who is really good at stealth, and none of the other characters are particularly good at stealth. In a lot of kind of D&D-ish games, it seems like what that often means is, well, we can get one person in there for a sneak attack, but stealth isn't really going to work for the party. And the momentum system sort of elegantly handles this idea of, well, the person who's good at stealth can kind of lead everybody along to do a better job than they would do on their own, even if not as good as like somebody who's really trained at it, so that you can take advantage of all of those kind of specific party niches that would normally not be as easy to take advantage of as the party.
You mentioned...
So yeah, pretty good game. The books now are pretty expensive because they're all out of print. Modiphius also apparently planned on a couple more books that never actually got printed, because in like Conan the King, there's a reference to the Pict book that never got to see the light of day. And, there's a couple of things like that, but,
So you mentioned,
and there's one more. There is, in addition to all this Conan stuff, there is a Cull of Lucia, King Cull of Lucia, Cull the Atlantean source book from the third wave that is also really cool. And so if you're going to play Conan anyway, you could play in Volusia and do all of that sort of stuff too.
Yeah. Yeah, I think I've noticed that in the Modiphius 2D20, and I think it was like the third game, right? So they had a Mutant Chronicles, then Infinity, and
Mutant
Conan.
Chronicles, then Infinity,
and those early games. Infinity, and there is in Infinity, there is a way that you can also break the game and play a much more powerful character than the rest, right? So, So I think in the early games they really didn't play all the. Like many things, high level play or play where someone tries to break the system and finds all the shortcuts or procs to break things isn't really explored. Then I think these early games suffered from that, right? But even still, I think the 2D20 games, they have this like a magic can clear the field, right? I saw that in the Cohorts Cthulhu, and I saw that in Auction Cthulhu. I've seen that numerous times, right? Where a person who's a spellcaster can just clear the field, and I guess that's a problem. I don't know if it's a problem, but in the Conan, it also happens. I think, right? So, or you have like the fighter, like you described, that just. Right.
Well, and there's also, I think, aside from the ways you can build your character broken, one of the other things that there's not like an obvious way to handle it, but the way that character growth happens is through experience points, but you just buy things that you want. And because almost all of the upgrades affect like each role individually, it basically, unless you're specifically trying to work on a specific character build that is not a combat monster, it almost certainly makes sense to put all your points into all of the combat monster perks before anything else, because that's what you roll your combat rolls way more times, right? If your character does melee combat, you're going to roll melee combat, 4 times per combat in an adventure, probably get, 3 times as many rolls as your next used skill. So why would you put it in anything other than the place where it's going to be like by far the most effective, which is not, it's not the end of the world, but again, this is maybe a reason to check out the John Carter 2D20 game also, because they have a cool thing where when you actually build a perk out of specific bonuses, and when you build a perk, you're not allowed to use multiple perks on a single roll. So one you have your one combat perk that is the thing that you do in combat, you put points into other things because there's no reason to continue stacking that one, which kind of helps with not just having every character be like, oh, here's the 5 melee perks or 5 range perks or whatever else, and these are the first things I'm going to get as I develop my character.
Yeah. So we're talking about games that have specifically been created for Conan or to play in this Conan setting. Let's talk a little bit about games that are still more inspired by Conan and inspired by Robert Howard, but aren't specifically Conan branded, whether it's official or unofficial games. I guess, Daniel, you started off the last one talking about the Age of Conan, and it leads right into your own homebrew and Unchained. You want to tell us a little bit about that system?
Sure. Yeah. So I was so for me, I think this is generally true, not just of Conan, but of almost anything. I'm not sure that I'm big on IP games. I think there's too much wrapped up in it. And I like things that have the flavor of a thing a lot more than the thing. So, as much as Age of Conan's cool, I could read some Conan novels and add my own worlds if I wanted to do that. But I started building my own game based on the idea of using chainmail and OD&D, but what I found was that it still didn't have everything Conan for me. And like I started to hit at was, so I actually have 2 games I'm building at the same time. And I made a simpler game that was strictly made for sword and sorcery, to play with one character and to play with a smaller group. And I really just used chainmail as the basis, and I just added role-playing elements. And it's interesting that Jason was talking about the TSR thing, because my game effectively says, write down your history, reasonably in a few sentences. And that's what you're going to base your character on, because that's kind of Conan. There's nothing really locked in. He does a lot of odd things. And like a strictly skill-based game, I think, isn't exactly what you want in this. You want something looser that kind of has a history. And the way, you want Conan to be very powerful, but you also, your character would be, but you also don't want it to be unkillable either, because Conan does in the Howard stories get knocked out, get captured all the time. Like Conan runs, because I think people who've only seen the comics and stuff or have this idea of Conan think that he's just like standing on top of a mountain of bodies all the time. Conan is constantly losing. Like that's basically he wins in the end, obviously, but that's basically Conan's story. It's like he sticks with it, right? Kind of what I said, he has that resolve. So what I did was I stripped everything back, and I'm effectively just using chainmail and adding role-playing elements, because chainmail has this very specific idea that when you're a hero or a superhero, as Conan would be, you can't be killed that easily. Like you need so many actual strikes by a regular person. So what this actually builds is this idea that you can have a character. Like I could make a character with 100 hit points, let's say in D&D, but eventually they're going to have 10 hit points. But in the way that I built the game was, as long as they don't go down by that lucky strike from the bad guy, they're always fighting the same strength. So it allows you to go through this like cinematic thing where you're fighting all these bad guys. And when you get to the final foe, you're not at like 1/10 of your hit points. You're still full strength. And I think that actually adds a cinematic quality to it. So I just basically, if you're going to make a game like this or work on a Conan thing or any of these like sword and sorcery things, you have to think of it almost like movie style, right? You have the reality of the world, not the reality of life, right? And the idea of like all these cool systems, and we kind of talked about this with the detailed combat. It's like all the strikes and nicks, and it does this and stuns and this and that is fine, but in the end, Conan still stands strong at the very end and strangles the giant ape, before it kills him. And if you have these attrition systems, you can't do that. So what I kind of base mine on is that until you're down, you're up, and it's all about story. It's all about narrative and the other characters, because anybody who's playing is playing a hero. And then if you're playing and then you have 2 or 3 players, you start playing sidekicks. And that's just the way that the game works. Like I'm playing my hero today, so Arlen's going to be a sidekick, or Jason's going to be a sidekick. And then next week, Arlen's playing their hero and we're sidekick, whatever. And that's kind of how I thought we could reach that, because when you get to the Frost Giant's daughter and you have 4 heroes, it's not the same thing as having one hero. And I think that's one of the tricks, or one of the concerns of me when I'm getting into a sword and sorcery game, like trying to make it work that way. So a game that's designed for a smaller group, a game that's designed to not have like we'll call petty attrition, is really the key to me having fun playing that kind of game. When I do my $1 million Kickstarter, I'll tell you if it was successful.
The thing that makes me think of is the first critique people are going to say is, well, if your minions can't hurt you you sort of move that attrition thing where they can't whittle down your hit points and you're at full strength. I think a lot of people would not like that idea, but I think you have to remember that you can raise the stakes by having a timer. Like the big bad guy is powerful and I need my full strength to fight him. But what he's doing in the middle of that castle, he's summoning a demon that's going to devour the world. I need to stop that ritual. And these minions can't hurt me. But there's 100 of them and they can slow me down because I still have to take the time to kill all of them to get to the gate.
100%. And what's actually very funny about that is early on when I started, we're not running the specific sword and sorcery, but we're running the main game. A couple of my players come from Pathfinder 1 background in 5e. And after about maybe 5 or 6 sessions, they said, I love the idea that we're not counting hit points and that you're either up or down. They're like, this game, I'm always at the edge of my seat. I could be dead in one hit or I'm just kicking butt. And it's funny because you don't think that when you look at it. You're like, oh, I don't know. Really, I could die anytime. Yeah, that's the cool part, right? And it makes the story make you make the choice, not your hit points. You don't look at your sheet and go, oh, I got 7 hit points left. I need to retreat. It's more like, what's being described to me? What's happening? When should I retreat? Based on the narrative. And I think it does make you focus on that more, which I think is really important in sword and sorcery, maybe even more so than anything else. And of course, it scales up to do full scale combats because it's based on chainmail. So you can have a fight with 100 soldiers and take, 5-10 minutes table time if you don't use miniatures.
Yep. Well, that's really cool. And you've got, I know you've put out like samples of the rules before. Is there a place?
Yeah, you can get the rules for free. They're in their current state. It's on my Patreon page, but it's in the free part. So I'll give you a link.
We'll put a link on that. So the next one we want to talk about was Barbarians of Lemuria. Jason, I know this is a game you really like. So what can you tell us about Barbarians of Lemuria?
Yeah, so Barbarians of Lemuria is created by Simon Washburn. It's gone through a couple of iterations. The current version is Mythic, and that's still the current version of it. Currently, you can't buy it because it's being kickstarted for a new version. They passed it over to the company that's done the French version of it. Once that Kickstarter is over, depending when this comes out, the Kickstarter may be just finished when this comes out. But as soon as they deliver the PDFs, which have new art but the same rules, to the backers, it'll be back up on Drive-Thru RPG. The Barbarians of Lemuria is a really fast-moving, interesting game. It has a lot of the features we've kind of already talked about here. It's, you have a country of origin that you pick where your character comes from, and that defines certain traits that they're going to have. You have your basic character set up. You have 4 attributes: strength, agility, mind, and appeal, and you have 4 points to distribute there. You have 4 combat abilities: initiative, melee, range, and defense, and you have 4 points to distribute there. You have 4 careers, or 4 career slots, and you have 4 points to distribute there, and you can pick all the different careers, which again gives us this idea of a character that's been around for a while and has a history because they've gone through different careers and have different skills. And one of the great things with Barbarians of Lemuria is a career, instead of having a huge range of skills, if you're a sailor, you can do anything a sailor can do with that career, however many points you put in that career. So you can navigate by the stars, you can tie knots, you can drink heavily, whatever sailors do, you can do, right? And so that's kind of cool, and you can justify those various things. It also has hero points, which you can use to do heroic things. So instead of, it has rules for rabble or mooks, like we talked about before. So if you spend a hero point, where you roll double 6s to allow you to do that hero point, you can, instead of rolling damage, whatever your roll is how many mooks you take out with a single swing, to kind of simulate there in the movies where you pick up that bench in the tavern and swing it and take out 3 or 4 or 5 guys at once. So you can do that in this game, right? Which is really cool because you feel like you're a sword and sorcery hero in this game. The magic system is very freeform. It's not nearly as dangerous as these other ones we've talked about. Magicians are kind of encouraged in this game because they are fairly powerful, although you have a limited amount of points, so you can't do a ton of magic throughout the session. But it is, very free form, and you work with your GM on what you can do. So it's very cool. Overall, it's really cool. It's got an inbuilt setting loosely based off of Lemuria, like the Thongor Lemuria books for Lynn Carter. But you could easily run it with a different setting for using Conan. What I've done is picked up the Marvel official handbook of the Conan universe, which is kind of like a setting book for the Marvel comics. And you can take that or take the Howard stories and just overlay that on Barbarians of Moria very easily and run it. So I highly recommend it. And it's a great fast moving game that lets you get a lot done really quickly in the game. It doesn't bog down in combats or bog down in a lot of details. The last thing I'll mention with it that feels very Conan when you think of like the movie, especially the movie, but other things. The way you level up in this game is after your great adventure and you've got the Sword of Gold, and this game doesn't worry about really detailed equipment and money or any of that. But at the end, you've got your loot. You come back. Well, then you have to go blow your loot in town, and you describe how you spend all this money, what kind of debauchery, and whatever you do with the money, and that's how you get your experience points. So you think about Conan the Barbarian after they leave the tower, and they're in the city, and they had all the gold, and then finally, he falls. He's drunk, and he falls asleep with his head in the soup. That's what they want you to be at the end of the session, or the end of the adventure, I should say. So of each adventure. So it's really cool, and it's built to do sword and sorcery, and I think it does a really good job at it, being a fairly rules light game as well compared to these other systems we've talked about.
Arlen, you wanted to talk about Riddle of Steel.
Yeah, so the Riddle of Steel. So I criticized Modifius's Conan 2D20 for being a bit of a mess. And by comparison, it basically looks like the Doryphoros or something compared to the Riddle of Steel or Blade of the Iron Throne is specifically the one that is marketed as being sword and sorcery. But it's kind of a very odd beast. The Riddle of Steel was actually written in a large part by Jake Norwood is his name, and he's was sort of into like the really early versions of a lot of the HEMA stuff. And it really leans into this idea of a much more realistic combat system, among some other things. The Riddle of Steel game itself is set in kind of a fantasy late medieval world, but Blade of the Iron Throne is a slightly more polished version of it that is designed as much more of a sword and sorcery game. And you can kind of see how the idea of a game built around this more realistic combat system. I know some other people that I've introduced this system to have compared it conceptually a little bit to Rolemaster and the way that Rolemaster crits work, with the idea that in this game, when you hit somebody, basically you roll your dice, they roll their dice. You compare successes. If you hit, then you figure out the severity of hit based on the type of weapon and the stats and all of that sort of stuff. And then what you end up with, because you've described a specific strike rather than I want to hit him. You like, okay, I'm going to stab him for region, whichever this is, right at like the center of the chest. And then it says, okay, so now all of that, and you get your severity of hit, and here's which arteries you have pierced as you've run them through, and things like that. And there's all of this kind of fascinating, very, very intense sort of blood and gore stuff that comes out of the way that what happens when sharpened metal meets flesh that is not nearly as strong as it, the way that it basically happens in real life, and gives you a good sense. One of the things that I think is cool about it is that you get a good sense of the realistic, like why you see like the English Civil War soldiers wearing a breastplate over their chest and a helmet, and then they've just got leather on their limbs. And the game makes a big point about, if you get hurt in your arm, you might not be able to use it, but you don't have any organs in your arm that are going to be irreplaceable, things like that. On the other hand, it totally moves away from this idea of being, I wouldn't say it is impossible to play it quickly, but it is definitely far too complicated in combat to get through anything like a speedy Howardian exchange without people who know the system really well, or who are just doing, the most basic elements. Because there's some pretty complicated stuff you can do in terms of like a parry and riposte, or like the master stroke is the term for when basically the movement of your sword covers you so that you block their strike as you hit them, and all of these things, beat is the idea. So in sword fighting, that's when you hit their weapon to get it out of the way. And you can imagine why, like if somebody is armed with a halberd and you only have your short sword, that might be really useful. And the game really models that sort of thing, right? If you are trying to hit them from a lot further than you can reach, you're going to have a hard time getting essentially close enough to actually hit before they can strike you, but at the cost of quite a bit of like bookkeeping and all these different elements. And if you look at, to use the comparison with Conan 2D20, right? Basically all of the weapons in Conan 2D20 have like, here's the damage rating and here's like 2 extra keywords that do something. And weapons in the Riddle of Steel are like, okay, well, here's the difficulty of swinging with the weapon, and here's the difficulty of a thrust with the weapon, and here's the difficulty of parrying with the weapon, and here's the modifier to difficulty if you use it with 2 hands instead of 1 hand, and all of these different, and here's the reach of the weapon, and here's the damage modifier in all these situations. So it's definitely not for the faint of heart. But it's also kind of a really fascinating exploration of, if you were trying to get really into what happens in the kind of realistic version of combat, and also wanted to play in this sort of sword and sorcery world, what that would look like. And there's some kind of cool, like I remember there's some kind of funky things, like one of the way they handle big animals is that something larger than human size just gets to reduce the severity of the wound that it took. And you can imagine why that means, Conan fighting a gorilla becomes really, realistically how difficult it would be for a person to actually inflict a wound telling enough on a gorilla before getting, literally ripped apart, because that would be really difficult because people just aren't physically built to take on gorillas. Now, if you bump up your stats to be like Conan, you actually probably could do it. And that's sort of, I think, where the game really shines, kind of like the idea of a superhero game that takes all that stuff realistically, right? A little bit like playing Champions and having, here's what a regular person is like, and here's what me 400-point superhero can do by comparison. Yep. So it's fun and interesting, but also I'm not sure I could really recommend playing it so much as just reading it and enjoying reading it.
Yeah. That's the mark of a true RPG aficionado, is you have games on the shelf you'll never play. You bought it to read it just to be entertained by looking at the rules and what people have come up with. So, finally on this, Carl, we're going to let you take lead on talking about Hyperborea. Although I think that's probably the game we probably all share the most experience with. I see Daniel's got the map on the wall behind him in his room there, and we play Hyperborea every other week. So go ahead, tell us. Don't tell us about Hyperborea. We know about. Tell the audience about it.
Yeah, I mean, I think Hyperborea is a good game, although I think it's not really right. It's the latest edition, at least. It's kind of like weird science fantasy.
It's definitely there's as much
science fiction elements.
There's as much Clark Ashton Smith and Lovecraft as there is Howard in there.
So so those are definitely influences in there. It does have that sort of less Renaissance feel and more, pseudo Iron Age, early Iron Age feel, right? There's so it doesn't, and it also caps at 10th level too, right? So, and then I really feel that it does have that sort of like idea of low magic, although there's a lot of magic items, low magic in a high adventure type of world, right? There's some epic type adventures that can happen, but it's generally got that how do you say it, that feel that everything's a danger, right? Yeah everything's always dangerous. I really enjoy it. I think it's one of my favorite retro clones, right? It has some elements from first edition AD&D as well as second edition AD&D. So, and I really enjoy it. I think one of the strength of it is like the number of different classes that you can. It's human centric. There's a couple ethnic groups that are a little different, Hyperboreans and Atlanteans, but for the most part, it's human centric, which I think is really neat. And it, you're in this strange world that's so flat, and and I think what the strength of it, like I said, is like the different classes. You have your sort of your fighter, your thief, a cleric, and magic user, but then they have, instead of having sort of the multi-class that you had in, for demi-humans in AD&D, right? They have like these hybrid classes that are like fighter. You have like fighter thieves and cleric thieves and the like. So fighter magic users, right? Like the warlock. So I think it does a great job of promoting that genre, and definitely the way that the world is set up. I really like how the adventures always have a bit of lore as well, so that builds on the world, right? So it's like you learn about the world as you adventure through it. That's definitely a trope. You when you first read Howard, you learned about the world, right? You didn't have like well, I guess he has an essay on the world in some editions, but you learn about the world through the eyes of the adventurer, right? Through Conan, and I think that Jeff Zelanian has captured that really well in Hyperborea. It's a fun game. It's really good.
To circle back to another earlier discussion, he also spells Chimeria with a K so that you don't say Cimeria.
Oh,
although
good.
In his version, it's the Chimeria that Herodotus refers to, that the Greeks thought about, which is basically like Eastern Europe, like the area of Ukraine, because they thought it was basically just directly north of them, and not like the area around Fredericksburg in November, which is what Robert E. Howard seemed to be thinking about.
That's funny. Oh, I did want to mention like how Jason mentioned about Barbarians of Lemuria and how you like lose your money through carousing. So there's definitely a mechanic in the Mongoose Conan D20 where you start an adventure with a small amount of gold and barely anything, maybe just the equipment that on your back, to start an adventure because you spent all your money carousing. So they definitely have that mechanic in there, which is pretty fun, somewhat irritating for player characters who are coming from a background in a D&D game where you accumulate wealth and you have like a collection of magic items that you never use because you forget there's so many. So that and they kind of take that different approach too. Is that it's not magic, it's like weapon qualities. So you have better weapon qualities because magic is really rare, right? And we only see one magic sword in Conan that I can recall, and that's the Sword of the Phoenix, right? In a story that was kind of Cole-like as well.
Yeah,
So.
yeah.
Well, it's not even the sword, right? It's just the symbol on it. It's
it's actually Mitra.
It's very
actually
specific,
and it literally was a Cull story first that didn't get published.
Right.
Yeah.
Well, what's interesting about too Hyperborea is that, as you were saying, is that I like how the world is designed in a way that like if where like there's these little pockets of civilization. And they've got their own like flavor, and that is also very much how like the Hyborian age is. You know that over here these are the peoples that raise sheep and ride horses or whatever, and over here we have and you can travel through these dangerous kind of uncivilized or populated areas, right?
Ruins of a bygone age too, right? That's another feature. Is you have these ruins everywhere that it's from this civilization that we don't even remember who this was.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah, and that's a big part. I think he does a great job with that. Like the world building is fantastic in Hyperborea, and you get the little snippets, like a sentence or two about each of the areas. But then, as like Carl said, when you get a module that takes place in that place, they flesh it out more. So it's like it's building and going as you adventure through. And it's a really well crafted system.
Yeah. Daniel has a long series on his YouTube channel.
Yeah.
So
I played
go check that
every
out.
module.
Yeah,
we played every module to that point that had been published.
That's cool.
There's like 9 or something. And now there's like 4 more that have come out since. But
I know
we played all the ways through each one. Yeah,
that's great.
It's super fun. One thing, sorry, I know we're running out of time, but I wanted to also mention, because we're talking about progress and money, I think that's another key factor. I feel like in Conan, money comes, money goes, things come and go, and that's also something that I wound into my game. Like I factor that in. Like you never get more hit points or whatever, but that's what matters. It's like your status in the world. And I think that's important with Conan. Where he stands, right? And sometimes he can go all the ways from being the general of an army to being a rogue running with nothing but a dagger and a loincloth because something happened. And that's just part of his life, right? Mm-hmm. And it's hard to do that in a lot of games. And I think that's in a sword and sorcery game, you want to still try to capture that.
Yeah, that ups and downs.
And Conan even accepts that. Like he's scrounging for a scrap somewhere just to try to survive. And then he starts talking and it's like, oh yeah, 6 months ago, I was like the general of this monarchs aren't. It's like
Yeah.
that's just the way
They were deposed, and I had to
that's just the way.
flee. And
Some days sometimes you're up, sometimes you're down, and that's just that's how
Conan just
Crom
keeps going.
intended it.
the introduction to the flame knife. I know it's not quite an official, but
Yeah.
where he's up on the
Yeah.
the tree or crucified, right? So
Yeah.
and he survives. So,
So one thing I wanted to say about Hyperborea that I think that is really cool that Jeff has done is he's created a sort of an homage to Howard's world, and he's found his own way to create that same. You get the same effects, but you get a new reason for why the world. So with Howard, it's these sort of talk about ancestral memory and things kind of come in cycles. They fall, but then they come back. And, the worlds in Howard, the different nations and the different
the cycle of
civilizations.
13 years too, right?
They really echo things in our real world that if we presume that the Hyperborean age is our past, they will come again in sort of our world. Well, here it's kind of the opposite. There's this sort of strange flat world somewhere in the cosmos, and little snippets of our world get sucked in. And so, we pulled in a bunch of Hellenistic Greeks got here. Well, they just created a Hellenistic society that now there's one over here. And look, some Vikings somehow showed up, and now there's a Viking society. And so it sort of creates that same effect of Howard, but in a new way. Where if you're not, it's just if you love Howard, here's a new world to explore where you don't know all the secrets yet, but you get that same energy.
Well, that's the old potentially apocryphal story that Howard started writing fantasy because he started at first writing historical fiction, fiction, and he got tired of people correcting his historical inaccuracies, so he just made his own world where nobody else knew. But that's part of why, like, even in the Conan stories, right, all of these different details of these different places are basically just settings for historical adventures that happen to all exist. I mean, right, like the Aesir and the Vanir land as being like, oh yeah, the names of the Norse deities are actually these people, and they all have these ridiculous, horned helmets, and they all act like Vikings, and they're, a vehicle for doing this fun adventure that otherwise you would just set in like Norway in 800 AD, but people might correct you if you did that.
That's funny.
You know what's interesting about that too is that in the Coming of Conan, the book series, in the intro, they talk about a writer that Howard really liked, and I had never heard of him before, so I of course don't remember off the top of my head. I'll see if I can get it to you, put it in the show notes. And I Googled him, and it was someone who wrote like not historical fiction, but like historical. Well, by our standards today, it would come off across fiction, but basically about like the Crusades and stuff. So I got one of these old books written in like the 30s or something, and I'm reading it, and the way he describes the armies marching and the way that things are forming, the land and the weather, and it's like I could see Howard's writing it here, and it's like, wow, you can really see how, even though this guy's writing about what they understood of the Crusades back then, I'm sure some of the facts might not be equal to what we think now. But it was really interesting to see how he was inspired by something that was actually like historical writing, not even fiction, like historical writing of armies and stuff. Yeah.
Yep. So here's a heck of a segue to kind of get to the last segment of the show.
Well,
I've actually got one first segue before.
Well, no, I was going to say.
I'm going to jump in and say that. Okay, we can talk about Reaver, but I was going to jump in and say also, I think people talk about D&D being a Western in medieval terms. Howard's Conan is totally a Western in all of these other settings, that it's the same kind of core ideas of, right, Conan is the man with no name with a gun who comes into a complicated situation and solves it and then leaves. And I think as soon as you get to, alongside the way that like the rising and falling civilizations are basically just boom towns in the American West that then fall apart.
No, that's accurate. That's so the reason I say this would be a good segue to Reaver is because, Joe Salvador, who wrote Reaver, did it with the idea of doing historical adventure, not true historical adventure, but kind of this based on like historical adventure fiction kind of stuff. And those are the kind of things he wants to recreate with Reaver. So actually that talk about like that with Hyperborea actually does lend itself to switching to Reaver, because that's kind of the things the kind of adventures you're going to run in that world.
And I was going to start off by mentioning that Joe Salvador created or wrote Forgotten Fane of the Coiled Goddess for Hyperborea.
Yeah.
But
it's a great adventure.
We're going to have Reaver, and what we're going to let Joe do is listen to this segment before we publish the episode, and he'll give us a call in with some comments and reactions to what we talk about. But there is a new Conan game on from
on the horizon, right?
on the horizon. They're still saying it's supposed to sometime this year. It's about to go into Kickstarter, but Joe Salvador's Reaver is currently on Kickstarter. I think it's got about 22 days left while we're recording this. I think we got a game actually scheduled tomorrow to play the full rule set with him. Carl, or is that going to be up on the Geomologist?
Yeah, it'll be eventually on the Geomologist.
Okay.
Probably like this week, as soon as possible.
Okay,
I have to talk to my producer.
And I think I know you and Jason have both already played Reaver. I don't know, Carl and Daniel, have you played any Reaver yet?
I have not played.
Okay.
Yeah,
But I did back it though, because everybody has been talking about it like it was the most amazing thing. So I was like, I must back. Yes.
Yeah, Joe's world building is phenomenal. I think. I mean, and we're not going to have like the full world in the core rule book, but hopefully if it's successful and we can encourage Joe to continue like that model that I think Gary Gygax did way back in AD&D and Jeff is doing now. You put snippets of the world through the course of the adventures, right? So I think that was brilliant how that develops, and you don't just give a world book. You let's let the player characters learn about the world, right, as they adventure. And honestly, I think did Forgotten Realms break that? Yeah, because they had a box set with all the world stuff in it, right? But
yep.
But I think I think that was the original intention, right? And that way you can. It gives the GM a lot of leeway to then, he doesn't have to have this sort of canon that he has to follow, but he has a basis and an idea, and then you just kind of add to it. And I think Joe's world building is really neat and really brilliant. And I think that you could definitely tell the basis of historical fiction and historical adventure with fantasy elements, sword and sorcery elements mainly. It definitely, I would say, is more on the gritty side. Although you can be heroic, right? But I mean, you roll for casting, and it's always like a risk. And that's as I played a shaman for a long time. I think the other players like, oh, I hope he fails. I hope he fails. So I want to see what happens. But and there have been some really bad failures, such that he's gained quote unquote mutations, and it's great. I mean, I think you want to have that that weirdness, that danger of the unknown. In the sword and sorcery world. And I think the mechanic that has evolved, mostly because of Jason and, and his total comments and commentary when we play. I don't know, he's blinking like he can't hear me, but it's really evolved to a very slick system, and a very intuitive system. So it's definitely well worth checking out. I think it's, just a unified mechanic where you can go up and down a dice chain, and the risk is still there because although you have the meta currency, it's a decision before you use the meta currency, which I think is fantastic, and it fits in with that sort of risk reward idea, that gambling idea that you want to have in a sword and sorcery type of game. Okay. And I think it's very like the different ethnicities are very evocative. The classes are really work. And he's done some really cool things, not just with classes, but with like careers that you learn or you pick up along the way during your progression. So it is a level-based system, but you also have these backgrounds and then these careers that you experience as you develop. So I like it. I like it. I really like too. It's not as complex as DCC, but for spellcasters, there's you have a spell, but you have like different variations of that spell that you can use, right? So I think that's really neat, right? So there's this nightmare spell that you can also, or a dream spell that you can also cause nightmares and also communicate with your friends over long distances. And of course, so I think it's really great how he does that. And then if you fail a spell, there's like a small table that's like, well, what happens when you fail the spell? So I think it's it gives some variation and some nice flavor to what's going on in the world and in the game.
Jason, anything you want to throw in there about Reaver with your experience with it?
No,
so
I
far?
think Carl hit it. Go to the go to the Kickstarter. You can get the quick start free off of Drive Through RPG. Maybe we can put a link to that in the show notes. So you can read the quick start for free if you go to the Geomologist YouTube channel, and there are links to these in the Kickstarter page. You can see where Joe joins Carl and they talk about the game. They talk about creating characters.
We create a character.
Yeah, you're going to see an actual play up here in a couple days. So check all that out. It's a really great game. It really is.
Yeah, and I'm playing the barbarian, so everybody else is playing my sidekick.
There
Exactly.
you go.
I guess that's it.
Yeah.
No, I mean, I'm playing a druid / soothsayer, so you're all following my
Yeah, I get Hobbs will say
My
he's
fear
playing
stuff.
he's playing a thief, and we're all just kind of he's probably just manipulating us all from behind the scenes, right?
Yeah. And it's really good. I mean, I like it, and I was going to say something else, but I'm sorry it escaped me about Reaver.
Well, the other thing I would say real quickly about Reaver is it's been through a lot of play testing. It really has over the years, and we've play tested it not just like the problem like has been mentioned with some of these other systems. We've play tested doing multiple sessions long, like months and months of playing at low level, medium level, and a high level. So this is one of those few games out there that has been play tested at a high level with the rules. And it actually works really well. And Joe's got naval combat, mass combat, all these kinds of things are built in there, and they actually work. And we play tested all that and used it during our games.
And the quick start is a very generous quick start. It has a whole like mini campaign in it, and some world building, like I mentioned, that Joe does, and it's a very substantial quick start. And there going to be some changes, but it's definitely pretty true to the core system of the game, and it has a really neat set of adventures and adventure sites. Really, it's like a small sandbox, which I think is the intention, right? Is the intention, like Daniel mentioned, of like points of light that I know it's cliche, but points of light, there's some civilization in a small area, and then out in the wilderness, it's extremely dangerous, right? Only for the not so, the people who want to take risks.
Right. So I think our plan is we're gonna play a little bit tomorrow. That'll turn into at least one video on the GMologist where you can watch us play the full system for a little bit. And I think we're going to reconvene on Cerebrevore, hopefully with Joe with us, and kind of do kind of an after action process through kind of how it went and what it was like. And so that'll be in another subsequent episode of Cerebrevore. So be looking for that.
Nice. Can I just add one thing? I just want to say I haven't played the game, but what I can say is for a while, Jason was doing play reports, and the play reports to me felt like a short, short story of a sword and sorcery. And no matter what, we can look at any rule set and go, well, this rule makes it, this rule makes it. But what really makes it is what happens at the table, right? Mm. And if what happens at the table feels like one of these stories, that's what makes it more like a Conan story, So that's ultimately, there's lots of ways to approach it. But this Reaver game did feel like that. And I was just looking at the Kickstarter again. The art is really nice, which always sells me. So I'll just say that. I mean, I already.
Yeah, he's got a good group of artists for this. They're really.
It just looks great. It seemed like the campaign you guys were testing really felt like that. There was fleeing from a city. There was like a ziggurat. There's always going to be a ziggurat. That's it, right? Like that felt like sword and sorcery based on. Anyways, for me, it was definitely a win. That's why as soon as it went on Kickstarter, I backed it. I didn't even read it. I just backed it. I saw it pop up, and I'm just looking at it now, and I'm like, oh, yeah, this looks really cool. Because it just seemed like, that's the stories I want to tell at my table. So I would definitely check it out. Support independent, creators too. There's
absolutely. Lots
of these Kickstarters that are doing lots of money that have all this backing, but this is somebody who's been in the field for a long time, but they're still independent. Like you don't see, Joe's not out there with the 17th edition of his game, right? He's just getting out there, and that's what we need to get fresh games out there. So,
but it's important to say Joe has done successful Kickstarters. He's published successful games like Elder Scrolls. So this isn't this isn't one of those Kickstarters where you really worry about fulfillment. The game's mostly written. Most of the money there is towards the publishing, towards the actual publishing, editing, and the art, especially the art.
Yeah.
So it's not, but this is definitely a safe one to buy.
Absolutely, yeah. We've seen the preview of the book. He's finishing it up. It's a guarantee. If you back it, you're going to get what you paid for.
Yeah, it's a small independent publisher, but experienced and accomplished one.
Yeah, he's been in the industry. Like as mentioned, he wrote the other. He's had that other game. The name slipped my thing. That's
the
like
Demi-Monde. The
Demi-Mondes that I backed. That was really
Eldritch
cool.
Tales.
Eldritch Tales. Yeah. So there's some really cool stuff. But again, it's independent, and that's always nice to back that. Get people. There's plenty of time to buy Free League when it hits the store. Back independent when they need it. It's like it doesn't need your Kickstarter money.
So. All right.
Sorry, Free League.
Well,
Sure.
you get big enough. You get big enough. You gotta.
Forbidden Lands 2E.
All right, this is BJ. I'm cutting in on our pre-recorded discussion because I let Joe Salvador listen to that last segment where we discussed Reaver, and he's got some responses that I want to share with the audience. So let's cut over to these calls from Joe. It's actually, I think it's technically one long call, but he had to leave a series of files to get it all in. So let me let you listen to those, and then we'll cut back to our conclusion with the regular panel.
Hello, fellows. It's Joe, and I just wanted to thank you all for inviting me to respond to some of your comments concerning Conan, Howard, and Reaver. And really, first and foremost, I want to thank you all for everything you're doing, supporting the Kickstarter, spreading the word about Reaver. I mean, it's just invaluable to me, guys. Like, I have like you mentioned, I'm a pretty small publisher. Like, my name's not huge. I don't have a huge internet following or anything like that. So every little thing like this, it just goes a mile, man. It's huge. Thank you so much. And you guys talked about quite a bit in your Reaver discussion, and I mean, there's not a lot really to say about what you've said. I do want to talk about something that Arlen brought up initially was that, Robert E. Howard was totally inspired by the authors of historical adventures, during his time and before his time, people like Raphael Sabatini and Harold Lamb. And like Howard, I'm greatly interested in the ancient world and history in general. And I am also inspired by historical adventure novels and short stories. Authors like Bernard Cornwell and Simon Scarrow, and even going back to Paul Anderson, they wrote some amazing stories. And really, like you guys mentioned, those first sword and sorcery stories were simply historical adventure tales with some magic involved. And that's where Reaver sits. That's what I want Reaver to bring to the table. And for a couple of reasons. One, I'm kind of following Howard's world building process, taking inspiration from the ancient world, kind of mixing it up, making it fantastic, and introducing it to the reader. And there's a few reasons for me to do that. Most importantly, I think, is that I just like the setting, any game setting really, to be quickly understood by the players and the GM. I don't want it to be hard to jump into or difficult to learn or be filled with just made up words, basically. That is all for me at least, it's counterproductive. So by taking this inspiration from historical places and peoples, somebody with even a passing knowledge of history or the ancient world can say, okay, I get it. I know these people are kind of inspired by, Greco-Romans or ancient Gaels or what have you. And the second reason that I like that historically based setting is that it helps create that sense of gritty realism that the player characters are humans in a dangerous world. Most of the enemies that they're going to meet are going to be humans. I mean, there are ancient alien entities. There's undead. There's ape men. There's Vormies. There's all of these other inhuman monsters in the game for sure. But you won't meet them all the time. In kind of rules as written, I guess, or at least in the way that I run it. But you will meet humans, and humans are unpredictable. Any group of nomads or pirates or whatever might have a guy in there that just happens to be 6 levels higher than the rest of the PC party, and that could be an extremely dangerous situation for them. And there's no way to know that, right? So it helps create that sense of a dangerous world that where life can be snuffed out pretty quickly. In a lot of cases, mechanically, characters can improve their damage that they do. There's damage reduction with armor and whatnot, but this is a spoiler. So I'm recording this after we ran the one shot, and BJ playing the barbarian, which you guys mentioned. The barbarians improve in the game. They improve their damage, all of their melee damage, but plus 1d. So a great axe that normally does 2d6, for him does 2d8. And most first level characters, PCs, have less than 16 hit points. If he so chose, he could have spent a resolve to add an extra die of damage, doing 3d8 damage to someone. That's pretty scary if you think about it for any character. A few hits from a 6th level fighter could totally change the game, really. So yeah, it's all in there. I like that. Like I said, the tagline for the game is more grit, less gonzo, and I enjoy the gonzo. I love weird science, weird fantasy. Obviously you guys mentioned I wrote for Cerebrevore. I love that game. I love the setting. I just wanted to do something different. I wanted to bring something different to the table. And my true love in the sword and sorcery genre is this style that is just a sidestep from a historical tale. So to swing back to the Robert E. Howard and Conan inspiration for the game, I mean, while I've read all those stories a million times, and Howard's dark and dangerous magic is in Reaver, Howard's visceral combat scenes, his fight scenes, I mean, who writes a fight scene like Howard? Those informed the way that I wanted combat in Reaver to run. It's never going to be perfect, but I think it's pretty close. Combat can be very quick, it can be very deadly. And even more importantly, it's Howard's link to historical fiction that really shows in Reaver. And I've said before that I feel like Reaver is almost a Braun McMorn game, more than a Conan game, simply because you could easily run Braun McMorn with Reaver. It's just right there. It's right there in that sweet spot for me of historical sword and sorcery. I'll listen back to this. I don't really know what else to respond to. I had some notes written down. Once again, guys, thank you so much. I appreciate it. All the best.
So a big thank you to Joe Salvador for that call and his response to our discussion. As we mentioned in the panel, check it out. I will put the links to the free quick start rules on drive-through to the Kickstarter itself. Go check out the videos that Carl has done with Joe on the GMologist Presents YouTube channel. I'll put links there. There's one where they make a character and discuss the rules, and then this one that just dropped this week where we play. And he talked about people wanting to be able to play quickly. Well, there are 4 players in there. Carl is one of them, along with Jason Hobbs, who have played and helped play test Reaver through its development. But also playing in that are me and Carl's wife, Amy, who were completely novices to the system. And I think you see how quickly we pick up and are able to work with the characters we're playing. So again, check out the videos, show Joe some love and support out there. And I will now take it back to our panel discussion to close out the show. All right. So I think we need to wrap up here as we do. I want to thank everybody for being part of the panel tonight. Arlen, do you have anything, final thoughts, anything you want to promote, mention?
No, I will say, people mentioned, but one of the best ways to read the Howard stories nowadays that Del Rey did a really nice collection of all of the Conan stories in 3 books, but then all of the Cole stories in their own books, and Brand McMorran in another book. And he's got there are a couple of collections
Solomon
of
Kane.
historical stuff. There's Solomon Kane. There's even if you don't want to get all of those, you can get, there's one like 2-volume set that's just the best of Robert E. Howard. That's just a bunch of great stories. And I assume all of those are still in print, or if not, they're probably cheap copy. The hell is that? Are you guys hearing from me?
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah, I think it's curious, right? Because I mean, like you're saying, these how expensive it is to try to collect the TSR Conan. I mean, it's definitely expensive to try to collect the Mongoose Conan, and the Conan 2D20 is creeping up in price and in the secondary market. So this stuff is popular among gamers and among people who probably read a Conan growing up, or have been introduced to Conan at some point through their their gaming experience. And so you see that the popularity of this, and it's definitely something that exists in the zeitgeist. It'd be great if we had another good Conan movie one of these days.
It would be. So Titan Comics now has the rights to do Conan comics, and they're reprinting all the old Marvel comic books
nice,
and omnibuses. They're like $120 from Amazon to pre-order them, but they're I mean, if you didn't get in, like I've got the Dark Horse collections from back in the day, but if you didn't get in those back in the day, it may be worth grabbing these Titan omnibuses, because the Marvel comic runs by Roy Thomas are really good.
Roy Thomas stuff.
Both Barbarian and the Savage Sword Conan.
Reading comic books is just like reading real books.
Yeah, a lot of them are just adaptations of Howard's stories, but later they do go off into their own stories. But they're
and the current Titan line, the current Titan run is really good too. They're on issue 14. And like 4 of Savage Swords. So if you want to get on the current Titan, now's the time to grab. And the Savage Swords especially are very, very good. They just put out the 3rd or 4th one. 1 and 2 are fantastic. 3, but they're all good. I'd get them and
you
support
guys we're talking earlier about the stories bouncing around, and it being like you're sitting there talking to Conan. Maybe he's telling you his life story. When Dark Horse did its actual run, I collected the first part of that, and the original way they were telling the story was, it is the narrator that says, "No, O Prince," in the days of, and it turns out there's this young prince, and the spoiler, the vizier that's advising him is, I'm blanking on the sorcerer, the Stygian sorcerer, the bad guy.
Thoth-Amon?
It's Thoth-Amon, and he's trying to tell him, listen, Conan was an idiot. This is what you don't want to be. But as he tells him the stories, this sort of young prince he's trying to manipulate is going, Conan was awesome. This is exactly who I want to be. And it kind of blows up in Thoth-Amon's face that he's done that. So,
I do have a question for the panel. I don't know if you didn't ask what everyone's favorite Conan story was, did you?
I didn't. Let's go through that. Carl, tell us what your favorite is, and then if you have anything to promote.
Yeah, I think it's Queen of the Black Coast. It really shows. It's almost like a Conan love story, and a tragic one at that. But it's really, it's like mid Conan career, and he's a Reaver, a pirate, and he has a love interest, and they have this one adventure. It's like one adventure, and the adventure goes south. And it's a fantastic story, and it really people always feel like Conan's one dimensional. I think it shows almost a different side of him. So I think that's why I appreciate that story.
Anything you want to promote before we wrap up?
I mean, check out the Geomologist Presents YouTube channel and podcast. I put the podcast on the YouTube, so it's getting there.
Okay. Arlen, what was your favorite Conan story?
Well, it's so hard to choose. I'm gonna say I really liked Beyond the Black River. I think so many of the Conan stories touch on specific themes that Robert E. Howard was interested in, and perhaps the most obvious one is this sense of like barbarism versus civilization, and Beyond the Black River does kind of an interesting twist on that, where Conan is on the side of civilization instead of on the side of the Pictish barbarism. But it's, I mean, aside from just being a great, behind enemy lines story, I think that one in particular has such a fascinating and wonderful atmosphere of being on the frontier and hearing the drums of the Picts. And there's this kind of great, like, it feels to me like I want kind of dungeon claustrophobia to feel like in games without being in a dungeon at all. It's just this kind of really kind of eerie wilderness environment that's difficult to survive in unless you're Conan.
Yeah. Daniel, what's your favorite Conan story?
Well, I was going to say Queen of the Black Coast, but Carl stole it. So I think Black Colossus is also really good. So in that one, I love it because you get a real sense of like Conan's like own personal code, if you will, because in the beginning of it, he's part of this army that basically gets wiped out, and he's like completely like living in the swamp, starving, whatever. And he sees like the leader of the other army, spoiler of course, and he fights him. He's like, I want to kill you because you wiped out he didn't have to do that. He was running, he was on the run, but he gets up and kills this guy because he's like, I'm still here, right? Even though he was a mercenary, even though it wasn't, they killed his dog brothers, as they say. And that part of it just really shows, again, another dimension of Conan. It's like, he even though he fights for money, he fights for gold, sometimes he fights for basically the honor. And that's just how it starts. And it ends with pirates. So there you go.
Good. Daniel, what do you got to promote for us?
You can find me on Bandits Keep.
Okay. YouTube, podcast. You're all over the place.
All over the place.
Daniel has the empire.
Yeah. Jason, what about you? What's your favorite?
So I don't do favorites. It's hard. There's so many good ones.
One that you reread now and again.
What's that?
One that you read now and again.
So
over and over.
Like I say, the Marvel comics are where I came into this. So I think for me, I like having that more sword and sorcery, although a number of the tales have magic and sorcery stuff in there. But I think I'm going to go with the Phoenix on the Sword, which is actually a rewritten Cole story. But it's an interesting story. He had just taken over the kingdom, right? He just took over Aquilonia, and then there's this plot to kill him, and all this stuff happens in there. But some of the battle scenes and some of the things that happen in that story are great, and I think it shows a couple different dimensions of Conan during that story. And so I think the Phoenix on the Sword, although I'm cheating here because you kind of have to read, you kind of pair that with Hour of the Dragon, right? I mean, they kind of like go together to some degree, those two stories. Yeah. But yeah, I think go with that. And if BJ doesn't mention one story at the end, I'll have to hop back in to say the other story you have to read, but BJ might say it, so I don't want to steal it from him.
And so you got, of course, the Nerds RPG Variety Cast coming out. Anything else you want to clue us to?
No, I mean, that's, check everybody else's, here shows out.
Okay.
But, yeah.
Well, I've, of course, got the Arcane Alienist podcast. I'm trying to get back into some regular stuff, or at least putting out one thing a week. I've shifted over to YouTube. So, and I think we're going to start putting Cerebrevore on my YouTube channel moving forward. Mm-hmm. But my favorite story is probably Rogues in the House. I think it shows Conan as a thief, but a strange thief, because he's also this big, powerful barbarian warrior. And it's probably got some of Conan's best one-liners and use of his sort of dark humor. It shows that Conan is not just a bundle of muscles that kills things. I mean, he kills things in the Rogues in the House, but just his sarcastic comments at everything that's going on and the ridiculousness of some of the situation. It's one of my favorites. So it shows both his wit and his intelligence, along with his ability as both a thief and a warrior. So, is that the one you were thinking about?
No, well, actually, I was thinking Red Nails, because there's so many different things in Red Nails, incling a strong female character.
Yes.
But Red Nails,
oh my God, we'll be here all night talking about.
Yeah, we won't talk about. But
that's why Nails, it was that, and
you need to read that. Red Nails.
Everybody's sleeping on the Devil Iron, which is, I think, so good.
Yeah.
It's such a beautiful, it's Robert E. Howard struggling with depression in the form of Conan fighting a character who's described as exactly like himself, but evil.
Yeah. So,
Right.
Yeah.
all right. Well, thank you guys. This was a great conversation. I think if I have one parting thought is, these license comes and goes. People, their fortunes rise and fall on the back of licensing Conan for their comic books, their games, their novels. But the one thing that always survives is Conan himself. So I think that's very fitting. So, all right. Well, thanks again, guys, and we'll be back in the future with another topic or maybe a follow up to this one. But keep your eyes out for the next episode. Good night.
Good night.
Good night.
A Nerds and Co broadcast, Cerebrevore podcast. Let's savor all the flavors from the simulcast strong. All stars and pods past, Cerebrevore podcast. You're counting down your last as you admire them all. The sound is blowing your teeth, also escaping your brain. What I mean is this machine's a freak. And from what I understand, now the Cerebrevore is coming, and all that's left is crying and the running. You can bring it, we can hide, we can above in any order. Just another way where we will toss us running for the border. Just a snap like a one. Did I stutter? Here and here. I expected buzz. You can eat on a billion, and it's Oscars never say it. Wasn't savoring the flavor of the movies it created.
I like the portrait of you that you have there. That you're professional. Like the one at Ghostbusters 2. That's a good portrait.
Okay. All right. Are we ready?
Yes, sir.
Okay. I do have a joke. Who wants to be the victim of the joke? Who wants to set up?
No.